They say history sleeps beneath our feet. But if you listen closely, truly closely, you will hear it shift in the night, like bones rearranging in a forgotten tomb. Welcome back, insomniacs and seekers of grotesque truths, to the only place where silence smells faintly of rot and wisdom crawls out from under your fingernails. I'm not here to sing songs of pharaohs or recount golden glories, burned into textbooks by men who never smelled the desert for themselves. No. I'm here to take you where the stories never got written, where they festered behind the walls. In latrines, in women's mouths, in slaves' underarms, in embalmers' rags, still damp with pus and prayers. Ancient Egypt, yes. The land of Ra and pyramids, of lotus-scented fantasies and polished limestone dreams. But tonight, we do not bow to the statues. Tonight, we dig into what they never wanted you to see. Their filth. Let me ask you something. Just you and me here in this shared breathless space. Have you ever scraped your teeth with the charred hoof of a dead goat? Not metaphorically. I mean, quite literally took a blackened sliver of rotting animal foot, mixed it with the cooled ash of burnt bread, and rubbed it against your teeth until your gums bled like Nile reeds cut too soon. Because the women and men of the Nile did. Regularly, religiously, proudly. They called it cleaning. I call it a war against your own body disguised as ritual. You see, history's greatest lie isn't that these people were clean. It's that they were obsessed with being clean. So obsessed, in fact, they became grotesque in the pursuit of it. It wasn't the dirt that made them disgusting. It was the desperation to appear unsullied, no matter the cost. And oh, the cost. It came in the form of crushed limestone ground into their tooth enamel like sandpaper whispers. It came as bat droppings in eye paint, mercury in ointments, crocodile dung suppositories shoved in places I won't yet name. Oh, but we will get there. Every filthy detail. Because if we're going to understand a civilization, we can't only kiss its crown jewels, we must crawl beneath its fingernails, mustn't we? You came here tonight, I suspect, because something in you has grown weary of the polite history. You've grown bored of watching Cleopatra seduce Rome over candlelight. You want to know what was in her breath when she leaned in. You want to know what was festering in her gums, what she swallowed that she never confessed, what stank beneath the linen. You don't want Hollywood. You want halitosis and hemorrhaging. You want truth. And that is what I intend to give you. Let's go back, not to the thrones, but to the thresholds. Imagine a woman in Thebes, her feet bare and blistered from stepping on sun-boiled stones, her breath labored from a lungful of sand. She's a baker's wife, perhaps, or a scribe's mistress. Her day begins not with water, no, not in this drought. It begins with powders, crushed bones, burnt barley, dried myrrh scraped off a temple floor. She mixes it all into a bitter paste and takes a sliver of bone or hoof and begins to scrub. And scrub and scrub until her mouth bleeds, until it stings, until the pain feels like purification. But what she knows him to know, what no one told her, is that these abrasives are slicing away the enamel, exposing the dentin, inviting infections to come home and nest. Her gums recede, her breath sours. Her teeth, yellowed and brittle, eventually fall out, and she whispers her prayers with a mouth of ghosts. But she thinks she's clean. She thinks the ash and hoof and lizard fat oil she rubs on her gums is God's will. That rot is merely the price of beauty. That the absence of stink must mean success. But there's something darker here. Something crawling just beneath the ritual. Because ancient Egyptian hygiene wasn't just about keeping clean. It was about keeping up. It was class. It was status. The royals, those high priests of appearance, would perfume their wigs with cinnamon oil and their robes with crushed blue lotus. Never mind that they hadn't bathed their skin in days. And the poor? They would mimic it with whatever they could find. Camel spit, moldy resin, and the most accessible of all, ash. ash that came from burned bread, burned linen, burned offerings. Anything carbonized would do. Mix it with goat fat or water, or even urine if you were particularly desperate, and you had a toothpaste worthy of the gods. A recipe passed from mother to daughter like a curse disguised as care. They brushed with this concoction. They rinsed their mouths with it. They believed the blacker the mix, the more effective the cleanse. Irony has a bitter tongue, doesn't it? Because it was this very blackness that ate away at their mouths, invited necrosis, and let maggots breed where love once lived. You see, this wasn't negligence. That would almost be easier to stomach. No, this was devotion. Devotion to gods who demanded the illusion of purity, even if it meant self-mutilation in silence. And that is why this is not just a story about teeth. This is a story about belief. About what we're willing to rub into our gums if the gods promise us grace in return. Now imagine this woman, years later, no teeth, mouth always dry from infection, breath a mixture of death and devotion. She still rises before dawn to prepare the paste for her daughter, who has begun the same ritual. Because if she doesn't, how can she marry? How can she serve in the temple? How can she be seen as clean? The ritual passes down like rotting inheritance, and no one dares question the pain. Pain, after all, is tradition's most loyal handmaid, but this isn't only about women. The priests did it too. The embalmers, the tax collectors, the guards who watched over the sacred crocodiles, all of them bore the cost of cleanliness in their mouths. And here's a secret. The breath of the divine often stank. Yes, even the pharaohs. The mummified remains tell no lies, jawbones warm to the nerve, teeth cracked from sand, abscesses deep as sins. Even the kings could not escape the ash. Their golden masks may sparkle still, but beneath them were mouths ravaged by their own beliefs. And so we begin. This is only the first flicker of flame in a long night of putrid revelations. We'll journey through their armpits, their anuses, their ointments and bandages, their twisted logic and desperate hope. We'll watch as beauty becomes brutality, as hygiene becomes horror, as gods become ghosts made of pus and powder. But for now, just rest here, in this taste. The taste of burnt hooves and ancient breath. The taste of a civilization that scrubbed its tongue raw in the name of purity. And the bitter truth that history was never meant to be clean. They called it the land of eternal balance, where sun and river danced in endless rhythm, and the dead were just as alive as the living if embalmed correctly. But if you think ancient Egypt was all gold and papyrus scrolls, you haven't smelled the truth rotting just beneath the linen. You haven't felt the sweat of a eunuch scraping lice off a noble's pubic hair while his own skin blistered from the sun. You haven't stood in the shadow of a temple, where the perfume of frankincense tried in vain to cover the breath of 1,000 mouths, raw by their own rituals. You haven't tasted the sand in their teeth, and tonight I will make sure you do. Let me lead you by the wrist, not the hand, the wrist, because hands in Egypt were for gods and husbands and statues of permanence. The wrist, thin and pulsing and vulnerable, is better suited for this story. Because you're about to walk into rooms no priest dared sanctify. We begin in the home of a mid-level noble, a man of enough rank to be remembered, but not enough to be embalmed perfectly. He wakes before dawn, not from peace, but from the smell of his own armpits. His linen sheets coarse, scratchy, reeking cling to him like the ghosts of yesterday's sweat. The Nile's breeze offers no mercy. His wife lies beside him, one eye open, one eye crusted shut from last night's coal melting into her tear ducts. They are considered clean. The neighbors envy them. And yet, if you were to lean in, just a little, you'd smell a history of infections behind her ear, the sour rot of skin, never quite dry, the yeast of every unspoken resentment fermenting in the folds of her body. But this morning is special. He has a meeting with the priest scribes at the temple. He must be, how do they say it, pleasing to the gods, so he performs the morning ritual. Not with water. Water is scarce, expensive, holy. No. He reaches for the jar of dried horse hooves, crumbled carefully by a servant who wore gloves made from the skin of birds. He mixes the black dust with a pinch of natron, a pinch of burnt barley, and a single drop of myrrh oil that's turned rancid in the heat. He dips a small stick smooth, carved from tamarisk, into the mix and begins to scrub his teeth, not softly, aggressively, with the same fervor a slave might use to scour a bloodstain from temple floors. Back and forth, until his gums are as raw as his pride. He winces. Blood mingles with ash. This is a good sign. It means the evil has been cleansed. He spits into a cracked alabaster bowl, watches the foam turn rust-colored, cleansing complete, but not really. His breath still smells of fermented onions and sleep. His gums are inflamed. His back molars ache from cavities that have burrowed deep like secrets. He knows this, but he cannot stop. The gods demand purity, and purity demands pain. So he continues. And so do thousands of others. Outside, the streets begin to wake. A woman sells fish that's already started to spoil. Children piss in the dust. A priest walks past with feet blackened from temple soot, his sandals long worn down to the shape of his guilt. Even the cats look tired, bored of watching humans pretend cleanliness is possible in a place built on decay. And through it all, the ritual continues. Hooves and ash. Ash and hooves. The rich use gold dust if they can afford it. The poor use animal bone or burnt dung. But the result is the same. A mouth on fire. A smile laced with infection. And a breath that even the gods pretend not to notice. But let's not stay in the noble's house. Let's descend, lower, dirtier. Let's slip through the cracks and into the quarters of the embalmers, the true alchemists of bodily horror. These men, sworn to make the dead eternal, often smelled worse than their clients. They spent their days gutting corpses, pulling intestines through tiny slits, drying them in the sun, stuffing body cavities with spices they could never afford to eat. And yet, each morning, they too brushed their teeth. Hoof, ash, myrrh. They believed that bad breath could offend the gods of the underworld, that a single whiff of decay, ironic, isn't it, might sabotage the soul's journey. So they brushed. With hands still stained with yesterday's bile, they brushed. With mouths that hadn't tasted fresh water in weeks, they brushed, until their enamel wore down to nothing, until their mouths bled like the corpses they cleaned. They had a saying unofficial, whispered, not in any papyrus you'll find in a museum. Only the clean may touch the dead, but it was a lie. Because the truth is, the clean died first. The sick lived longer, more resilient in their filth. The obsessively clean? They rubbed themselves raw with lye and natron, until their skin cracked and welcomed every infection the air had to offer. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a ceremonial knife. One used to slit open a pharaoh's side and extract his spleen like a rotting pearl. And what of the women? Oh, the women. Let no one tell you ancient Egyptian women had it easy. Their beauty was weaponized, their cleanliness fetishized. A beautiful woman who stank was less than a servant. So they scrubbed and masked and rinsed, sometimes with donkey's milk, sometimes with acid vinegar, sometimes with their own urine. They powdered their breasts with chalk to hide the fungal rashes. They shaved every inch of hair to avoid lice, but used blades so dull they left trails of scabs. And still, they brushed. Teeth first, always. Because a man might forgive a crooked nose, but never a stinking mouth. So they'd wake before dawn, mix burnt shells with honey and frankincense, and coat their gums until their tongues went numb. They smiled through ulcers. They whispered seductions with bleeding gums. They died with mouths full of ritual and regret. But let's pause just for a breath. Do you smell it? That blend of decay and devotion. That's the scent of a civilization in denial. Because for all their talk of cleanliness, Egypt was rotting from within. The Nile, though sacred, carried more excrement than Epiphanes. The markets, though bustling, reeked of sweat and spoiled grain. The temples, though grand, housed more rats than relics. And in this backdrop, the act of brushing one's teeth with hoof and ash became not a luxury, but a necessity. A desperate gesture against the inevitable. And yet, it worked. Not the hygiene, no. That was a disaster. But the belief, the ritual, the performance, it gave structure, gave purpose, made the filth feel sacred. And in a way, that's more powerful than any soap could ever be. Because cleanliness is, and has always been, a myth. A story we tell ourselves to feel better about dying slowly. The Egyptians understood this, deeply, intimately. And so they crafted a dance of filth and fantasy so elaborate, we're still performing it today. Have you ever looked at your toothpaste tube? Read the ingredients? Half of them come from the same alchemical origins. Burnt calcium, charcoal, aromatics designed to mask, not cleanse. The only difference is we've buried it under plastic and branding. But the hoof remains. The ash persists. The ritual never died. It just put on a lab coat and smiled wider. So as we move forward, deeper into this labyrinth of hygienic horror, remember this. The Egyptians didn't brush their teeth to get clean. They brushed to feel worthy. Worthy of gods, of husbands, of afterlives. And that worth was measured not by freshness, but by sacrifice. The more pain, the more bleeding, the more sulfur and salt rubbed into tender gums, the closer to divinity. And perhaps that's the most disgusting part of all. If you think the horror ended with the mouth, you're still blinking in the dark, still half asleep with your head resting on museum placards and fantasy hieroglyphs etched by scholars who never tasted embalming fluid under their fingernails. Because the filth of ancient Egypt didn't linger politely on the breath. It soaked through the skin. It fermented beneath the tongue. It nested in the folds of groin and armpit. It waited in the corners of ceremonial basins and trickled like oil through the pores of those who thought they had tamed the body. But nothing tames flesh, not belief, not gold, not gods. Flesh always remembers what it truly is, a sack of salt and rot on borrowed time. And no civilization proved that better than the one that tried hardest to deny it. You see, while the ash and hooves scraped away enamel by sunrise, another ritual began just beneath the collarbone. Deodorant, you might say, but don't picture a pleasant stick of lavender. Picture instead a paste of crushed ox bile and goose fat, aged in clay pots until the smell could stun a bull. This was no product of convenience. This was war. A daily battle between body and ego. They rubbed this bile paste into their armpits, their groins, their inner thighs, believing the stench of it would mask their own. But it didn't. It mingled. It grew stronger, like rot and roses dancing in a locked room. The result was not absence of odor. It was a new odor, layered and complex, like a lie told with just enough truth to be dangerous. Now, let me ask you something quietly, softly. So no modern nose wrinkles and reflex. What do you think happens to a body wrapped in linen while still sweating? What do you think festers beneath layers of perfumed fabric, clinging to unwashed skin in 40-degree heat? I'll tell you, yeast, mold, blisters, and in time, boils. Not the kind spoken of in apocalyptic curses, no. The slow kind, the quiet ones, that build like resentment in a marriage no longer spoken of. The kind of skin infection so common that no one even flinched when they burst. The blood and pus, wiped away with a strip of cloth, often reused by someone else later that afternoon. Because linen, like dignity, was too expensive to discard for a little human leakage. But they believed in cleanliness, didn't they? Believed so fervently that they weaponized it. Women were expected to smell of lotus and cinnamon. Their skin powdered white, their breasts dusted with chalk and frankincense, even when fungal infections bloomed beneath the surface. And when they bled, as all bodies do, they used linen rags soaked in vinegar and ash, then dried in the sun, reused until they crumbled like old papyrus. There was no disposal, just repetition. Pain was sterilization. The stinging meant the gods were watching. And so they endured, whispered prayers into cloth that reeked of rust and rot, and smiled through it. Meanwhile, the men weren't exempt. They, too, scrub it until their skin peeled. They, too, oiled their privates with mixtures of resin and bat guano, believing it would enhance virility and ward off demons. They shaved their entire bodies, not just for style, but to avoid lice, to mimic the priests, to offer their flesh in pure form to whatever divine or political favor they were chasing. And yet, in the absence of hair, came the abundance of irritation. Razor bumps that festered, cuts that became ulcers, skin that blistered beneath the unforgiving sun, covered in salves made of crocodile fat, and salt, neither of which healed anything, but both of which burned like vengeance. Let's descend deeper, into the places no daylight touched, not the tombs, not yet, but the latrines. The forgotten rooms behind the baker's stall, the priest's quarters, the royal kitchens. Toilets, if you could call them that, were holes in the ground or pots emptied too infrequently. They reeked of ancient intestines, fermented grains, and fear. Privacy was a myth. You squatted where others squatted, sometimes on stones still warm from the last user. And when you were done, there was no toilet paper, no soft leaf, just whatever the hand could find, a shard of pottery, a fistful of sand, a crust of bread, if you were desperate or rich enough to waste it. The poorest simply used their hands, and rinsed, when possible, in communal basins that never saw fresh water after morning. Now imagine this basin. A shallow bowl of tepid water, darkened by use, ringed with the oil of a dozen armpits and the blood of a dozen more. It sits in a courtyard, open to the sun, covered at night, but not tightly enough to keep out insects. This water is sacred. It is limited. It is shared. And it is used for rinsing mouths, for washing wounds, for cooling feverish foreheads, for blessing meals, for brushing teeth with hoof and ash. Everything flows back into the same bowl, and they call this cleansing. But what choice did they have? The Nile was life, yes, but life with conditions. Its floods were divine gifts, but also carried corpses, feces, and animal remains swept from upstream. The people knew this, knew that the water that baptized them also poisoned them. So they filtered it through linen, through sand, through faith, and still they got sick. Dysentery was as common as gossip. Mouth ulcers passed between lovers like kisses. Parasites thrived beneath fingernails scented with perfume. And yet they believed. Belief more powerful than bacteria. Ritual more persuasive than rot. Now come with me closer still. Into the temple of Hathor, goddess of beauty, of music, of sensuality. You might expect incense, silk, songs. And they exist. But beneath them, beneath the chants and the painted eyes and the rhythmic clapping, lies the real heartbeat of devotion, the maintenance of illusion. The priestesses here spend hours preparing. They shave every inch of themselves, bathe not in water, but in milk, curdled just past sour, then coated in oil, infused with dried petals and dust. Their mouths are rinsed with a mixture of cinnamon and chalk. They chew herbs that numb the tongue and hide the bitterness of bile rising from their stomachs. And still, when they speak, their breath carries the scent of decay, hidden beneath sweetness, like a corpse in a garlanded coffin. They do not speak of this. It would break the spell. So they smile, eyes heavy with coal, breath held shallow. And the crowd bows, inhaling holiness that smells faintly of mold. But holiness isn't clean. It never was. The sacred always carries the scent of sacrifice, and in Egypt, sacrifice was soaked in sweat. The gods didn't want perfection. They wanted performance. Wanted people to try so hard to be clean that they tore themselves open in the process. And tear they did. With every scrub of ash, every rinse in fetid water, every cloth reused until it unraveled in shame, the Egyptians showed their gods how desperately they wished to please them. And the gods, silent, stone, unmoved, watched, or didn't. It hardly mattered. The ritual was its own reward, or punishment. Now drift with me into the house of the midwife. An old woman, her back bent like a question never answered. She has delivered more children than she has toes, two of which rotted off in a flood she wanted to speak of. She is respected, feared, called in when birth comes early or painfully. She keeps her tools wrapped in linen soaked in vinegar and herbs. Reuses them for years. She says they are sacred, and they are. They carry the scent of life and death and every moment in between. When she finishes a delivery, she washes her hands in oil, not water. The oil masks the blood, softens the skin, but doesn't clean. It only shifts the filth into a different register. She brushes her teeth with hoof and ash before every birth. Says it keeps the evil spirits away. But her breath burns the eyes of those too close. Still, they thank her. Still, they kiss her hands. Because when everything stinks, no one notices the source. And this, dear listener, is the secret Egypt never wrote down. Not that they were dirty, but that they worked so hard not to be. That their obsession with cleanliness created new forms of filth. That their rituals, while beautiful on the outside, often hid decay underneath. And isn't that the truest thing we've ever known about humanity? That we will mask our rot in perfume, wear our wounds beneath silk, scrub ourselves bloody, if it means someone, anyone, will call us pure? So yes, they brushed their teeth with ash and hooves, but more than that, they brushed away their doubt, their fear, their humanity, one bleeding gum at a time. You followed me this far, and that means your senses have started to adapt to the stink. Your tolerance has grown. That is the first sign you're waking up, truly waking up, not to the lies of clean history, but to the deeper, filthier rhythm beneath it. Don't flinch now. The worst has never been what you've seen. It's what you've believed. And in Egypt, belief had a scent. Not a divine perfume, no. A stench layered, acidic, like dried blood beneath incense. Like a body rotting under an offering table, while the priests chant louder to drown the smell. If you can still smell the frankincense, it only means you haven't gotten close enough to the truth yet. So tonight, let's lift another veil. Not the linen wrapped around the corpses. Not yet. Let's go back to the living. Let's sit beside the queens, the concubines, the royal daughters soaked in oils, dressed in gold, and rotting from within. Cleanliness in Egypt was currency, especially for women. And currency, like flesh, degrades. These women bathed, if you could call it that, not in rivers, not in flowing purity, but in milk left too long in the sun, in oils made from animals that died wrong. They scrubbed their skin with pumice and limestone powder, ground so fine it cut like betrayal. Their pores bled quietly. And the blood? Mixed with resin, mixed with honey, mixed with whatever priest-approved substance was said to appease Hathor or protect the womb. They smiled while it stung, because a woman in pain was a woman in control, or so they were told. And the mouth, always the mouth, always the breath. Queens were given special mixtures, more refined, more fragrant. Hoof, yes, but mixed with pearl dust, crushed from mollusks brought up the Red Sea, sandalwood bark, charcoal so fine it looked like night itself, and yet the result was the same. Bleeding gums, blackened molars, the slow rot of an empire, hidden in a smile. Imagine kissing a queen and tasting her death. It happened often. No one wrote it down. Even Cleopatra, that myth wrapped in silk, whose name became perfume long after her bones were dust. Even she could not escape the rituals. Her attendants documented her beauty regimens with trembling pride. But not one dared mention the abscess behind her last molar, the one she had lanced with a fishbone dipped in vinegar, the one that festered for weeks and made her favor only soft foods, the one that leaked pus into her wine. No poet wrote about that, but it happened, because queens are not spared, only worshipped as they rot. And what of the children? The sacred sons and daughters offered to the gods as clean slates soaked in ritual, masked in myth. Their hygiene began before memory. Their heads shaved, not for fashion, but to spot lice easier. Their mouths rinsed with goat bile and date extract. Their tongues brushed with salt and herbs that blistered the skin. They were taught to fear their own smell before they could speak, to scrub where no one would see, to bleed quietly, to never flinch. These weren't just children. They were temples in training. And temples must appear pure, even if they crumble from the inside. But if the elite suffered in silence, the poor screamed in the dark. Their rituals were not gilded. They were desperate. They couldn't afford myrrh or cinnamon. So they made do with what the land gave. Ash from dung fires, resin scraped from storage jars, the blood of slaughtered animals mixed with spit. They brushed their teeth with these, yes, but also their wounds, their babies' navels, their hopes. They told themselves it was enough, that the gods saw effort, not ingredients, but their bodies told a different story. Gums that blackened before 30, teeth that fell out like leaves in flood season, tongues so coated in rot that speech became a labor. And yet, they kept brushing, because to stop was to surrender. And surrender meant shame. So even in agony, they persisted. Even in blood, they smiled. Let's visit the healers now, not the priests. The women who worked in back rooms with bowls of vinegar and stolen oils, who mixed poultices from bone and mint and rubbed them on lesions they dared not name. These women knew the truth. They saw it in the sores, the stinks, the silent tears. They whispered to each other about the infections that came not from demons, but from the very rituals meant to banish them. They tried to fix what belief had broken. But they were called witches, accused of impurity. Their hands, always moving, always trying to heal, were the dirtiest of all in the eyes of the righteous. Because to clean without ritual was heresy. To touch decay without prayer was sin. And yet they continued, in secret, in shame. They saved more than the temples ever could. But no statue was ever built in their name. And what of love? Of intimacy in a world where every inch of the body was a battlefield between scent and shame? Lovers would anoint themselves with oil before touching, not for romance, but to hide the rot. They'd chew bitter herbs to mask the breath. They'd rub clay between their thighs to prevent the rashes that came from shared sweat. But it didn't always work. The skin still blistered. The mouths still festered. The sheets still stained. And in the silence after, they'd lie beside each other and pretend it hadn't happened, that their bodies were not failing, that the gods were still watching. And maybe they were, watching and laughing, or weeping, or turning away. The priests certainly believed they were being watched, that every pore, every breath was an offering. And so they obsessed. No hair, no scent, no deviation from the script. Their teeth were brushed 5 times a day. Their underarms scrubbed with lemon rind and urine. Their anuses washed with sand and salt. Their fingernails cleaned with obsidian blades. Their mouths burned from constant ash. And still, they feared it wasn't enough. That some impurity might hide in the crease of a toe and damn them forever. So they burned their own skin, sliced off suspicious moles, carved out infections with knives blessed by chance. And the people called them holy, clean, untouchable. But the maggots came for them too. And now, finally, let's go where you've known we would end up. the tomb, the embalming table, the final hygiene. Death in Egypt was not an escape from ritual, it was the culmination. The corpse was shaved, drained, packed with resin and linen and natron. The same salt they'd rubbed into their teeth, now poured into their chest cavities. The mouth was sealed shut with wax. No more breath to offend the gods. No more tongue to confess the rot. The body was painted, perfumed, masked, and buried. Perfect, except not. Because beneath the mask, the skin sloughed. The teeth loosened. The gums, long since shredded from decades of hoof and ash, gave way entirely. And yet they were remembered as pure, because the performance was complete, because the lie held, because no one dared sniff the truth. And that, dear wanderer of the sleepless night, is the tragedy most ancient of all, not that they were filthy, but that they scrubbed themselves raw to be clean and were never believed. Not by the gods, not by themselves, only by us, centuries later, still telling their story with rose water and gold leaf, afraid to taste the ash still clinging to their bones. But I'm not afraid. And now, neither are you. You're still here, which means something inside you has broken just enough to let the past seep in. That's good. That means your skin is softening like linen left too long in Nile mist. And now you can feel it, can't you? The dampness beneath the bandages of history, the slow trickle of pus beneath perfection. Most will never feel it. Most will keep polishing the golden mask, never daring to touch the mold blooming behind it. But you're not most. You're the one who stared too long into the sarcophagus, can notice the teeth. Let's return to those teeth, shall we? Because while the rituals may have varied, and the gods may have changed their names, depending on the direction of the wind or the mood of the priest, the mouth never lied. The mouth was a battlefield, a site of endless violence masquerading as devotion. And in ancient Egypt, that violence was sacred. To clean the mouth was to clean the soul. Or so they believed. And so they declared war on their own bodies, every morning, every dusk, in silence, with mixtures not meant for living flesh, but for exorcism. Ash, yes. Rotting hoof, of course. But also burned eggshells, crushed scorpions, powdered shells of river crabs, all charred until black, all mixed with sour milk or goat urine, and applied with a trembling hand to the soft pink gums of a hopeful believer. Hopeful that this time it wouldn't hurt. Hopeful that this time the bleeding would be a sign of cleansing, not the precursor to another infection. And always disappointed. Imagine a child of 7, already missing 2 molars from rituals begun too early, breath sour from decay, masked in myrrh, praying not to be punished for the stench. And now imagine her mother, watching, nodding, proud, because to bleed was to try, and to try was to be clean, and to be clean was to deserve life, or at least not deserve more suffering. Not yet. But there was suffering anyway, the kind that came not from sin, but from the very tools used to escape it. Toothsticks carved from animal bone, notched roughly, impossible to clean, reused until they cracked. Powders stored in clay jars, kept beside the hearth, absorbing smoke and mold, and whatever insects died trying to crawl inside. Water was scarce. Ash was plenty. Pain was inevitable. And still they brushed, until their mouths were caves of rock painted to look like sanctuaries. But the mouth was just the beginning. The true obsession, where the worst lies festered, was the anus. Yes, the sacred, silent, shamed part of the body no one wrote poetry about, but everyone feared, the priests especially. Because if the mouth was the door to the divine, the anus was the open wound of the human. And in a society so terrified of impurity, of smell, of anything uninvited leaking from the body, the anus became a battlefield too. They cleaned it not with water too holy or cloth too expensive, but with natron, ash, and sharp-edged leaves. They believed the stinging was a blessing, that the pain was proof the filth was leaving, that if it bled, it meant it had worked. And it often did bleed, small tears, hemorrhoids burned by salt, infections deepened by vinegar, applied without knowledge, but they endured, because the gods were always watching, especially when you bent down. And when that wasn't enough, they inserted suppositories made from crocodile dung and fermented bread, wrapped in linen, soaked in honey and goat bile, for cleansing, for fertility, for blessings, inserted by hand, by midwives, by lovers, by trembling fingers before prayer. And then they would wait, clench, sweat, pretend not to feel the bubbling, pretend the sting was sacred. And when the linen emerged, stained and smoking, they called themselves pure, for one more hour. But purity, like linen, frays. Let's follow one of these so-called clean women into the temple. A singer of Hathor, young, luminous, and slowly dying from what she doesn't know festers inside her. Her daily preparation is 5 hours long. She begins with a scrub of her entire body, using ash mixed with camel milk. Her skin blisters under the friction. She applies oil next, perfumed but rancid from the heat. It doesn't absorb. It sits, sours, crawls into her pores like whispers. Then she cleans her teeth with a paste made from dried mouse bones and mint. Mint, because the temple still has foreign trade. Mouse, because it's all they could find last week. She brushes until she gags, until she bleeds, until she feels faint. She rests, then begins again, because this is duty, this is worth, this is God's love. By the time she enters the main chamber, her gums are swollen, her thighs are slick with oil and sweat, and her mouth tastes like iron and hope. She sings, and those who listen fall in love, with the sound, with the illusion, with what they think she is. No one notices the rot at the back of her tongue. No one dares. Now step into the room where the scribes write down the laws, not with ink, but with silence. These men, the keepers of memory, smell faintly of ash and decay. They chew resin to keep the breath fresh. It only works for the first minute. After that, the resin ferments. They clean their fingers with vinegar, thinking it sterilizes, but the cuts from the papyrus invite infection faster. Their teeth are worse than any class. Yellowed, chipped, filled with soot. They know it. They joke about it, but not too loudly, because someone might hear, and shame is only funny when it's private. And so the rot persists, across classes, across genders, across temples and alleys and palaces alike. Even the animals smell it. The sacred cats, adored and feared, refuse to lick their owners. They smell what the humans cannot admit. The gods don't intervene. Perhaps they're used to the stench. Or perhaps they were never there. Now let's go lower, underground, into the workshops of the embalmers. We touched them before, but not deep enough. Not yet. These men live in filth. Not by choice, by design. They are both revered and reviled. They touch the dead, and so must never be fully clean again. But they try. Oh, how they try. They scrub themselves raw with sand before every preparation. They gargle with brine before sealing a corpse's mouth. They change their rags more often than most change their thoughts. And still, they stink. Death clings. It always does. One such embalmer, old now, his hands twisted from years of salt and time, sits in a corner after finishing a nobleman's body. He opens his mouth to eat a fig, but winces. Another tooth gone. The paste he used that morning was too sharp, too acidic. He spit blood for an hour, then went to work anyway, because cleanliness waits for no one, not even for pain. Especially not for pain. He has no wife, no children. Only jars of ash and linen and teeth that no longer belong to any living thing. And in his sleep, he dreams of water. Clear, sweet, impossible. The gods never gave him that. Only fire. Only dust. Only lies about what makes a man holy. So where does that leave us? Not at the end. We're nowhere near the end. We're still brushing the surface with a dead animal's hoof. Still pretending it's progress. Still calling it sacred. And maybe, just maybe, the most terrifying truth isn't that the Egyptians did these things. It's that we still do. With better packaging. With fluoride and foam and a smile. But deep down, we still believe that suffering cleanses. That burning proves we're trying. That if it hurts, it must be working. And so we spit the blood into our sinks. Smile through ulcers. Hide the pain behind ritual, just like them. And the gods, if they exist at all, still aren't watching. There is a peculiar moment when belief turns to madness, not with screaming, not with visions, but in the quiet insistence that something must be done, because it has always been done. That is where Egypt lived. In that space between conviction and compulsion. In that hollow under the ribs where shame masquerades as virtue. And the deeper we go, the more it's clear. Cleanliness wasn't just a practice. It was a religion. A weapon. A slow self-murder done in the name of staying presentable to gods who likely never asked for it. Because no true deity would require you to bleed from the mouth every morning just to prove you were worth keeping alive. But they believed it anyway, so the rituals deepened, and the madness became method. Let's go now, not to the palace or the peasant hut, but to the border where soldiers stood beneath the weight of the sun, and their own sweat, facing enemies they couldn't name and dangers that never arrived. These men were supposed to be protectors, but most days, all they protected was the illusion of order. Their weapons rusted, their boots cracked, their mouths reeked. Because even out here, where no priest watched, the rituals followed. Teeth were still brushed. Ash still ground into the gums with the same reverence as if they were standing in a temple courtyard. But water, real, clean water, was a ghost. So they brushed with dust, with the ashes of burned uniforms, with sand from beneath the feet of the dying, and they whispered the names of gods they weren't sure still listened. One soldier young, already cracked by the sun, already missing a front tooth from an infection, gone too deep, writes home to his sister. Not in ink. In his blood, mixed with resin and scratched into a thin piece of linen, he hides beneath his armor. He tells her about the pain, about the tooth that broke when he bit into dried dates, about the swelling that won't go down, about how his commanding officer gave him a paste to brush with, made from cow dung and salt, how it made his eyes water, how he used it anyway, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be allowed to enter the morning prayer tent. And if he didn't pray, he might not be blessed before battle. And if he died unblessed, he might not be buried with ceremony. And if he wasn't buried with ceremony, he wouldn't be remembered. And to be forgotten in Egypt was worse than hell. He ends the letter with a single line, "Tell mother I still brush." And then he bleeds into the dirt and doesn't wake up. Meanwhile, in the cities, the rituals evolve. The elite begin importing powders from other lands, whiter, finer, deadlier. Crushed marble, ground pearls, pulled from distant mines by men who would never live long enough to see Egypt. These powders are mixed with goat milk and beetle extract and advertised as superior, cleaner, closer to godliness. The nobility lap it up, not because it works, but because it costs. Pain now becomes a luxury. The bleeding gums of the rich are seen as a mark of devotion. The raw tongues of the poor are just unkempt. And so, once again, the body becomes a battlefield for status. Let's step into the room of a young noblewoman. She has 3 servants dedicated solely to her mouth. One mixes the powder, one applies it, and one fans her while she cries. The powder today contains crushed coral too sharp, too foreign. It slices her gums as it's applied. She gurgles. She smiles. She says, "It tastes like worship." And they nod. Because to question the pain would be to admit the truth. That none of this works. That none of this ever worked. That the mouth is dying beneath the perfume. Later that night, she will attend the feast. Her breath will reek of blood and frankincense. She will laugh. And no one will mention the way she spits pink into her napkin between every bite. No one dares. Now come with me to a different corner. A brothel near the river. A place where cleanliness is sold alongside comfort. The women here are considered desirable not for their bodies, but for their scents. They wash, yes, but not with water. With lemon oil and smoke. Their breath is masked with mint chewed until it numbs the tongue. Their teeth are blackened with clove to appear exotic. One of them, older, with half her teeth gone, has a secret recipe. Hoof ash, papyrus shavings, and a drop of wine. She says it keeps her mouth strong. She says it makes the men forget how old she is. She says it works. It doesn't, but the lie sells better than the truth. She died last year. Infection. Jaw swelled until it cracked. No ceremony, no priest. Just her name etched in the corner of a wall with charcoal, and even that faded by morning. But the ritual continues. Another girl takes her place, learns the recipe, bleeds the same, smiles wider, because that's what survival looks like. Let's go deeper now, into the minds of the priests, the ones who created these rituals, the ones who wrote that cleanliness was next to godliness only in their language. The word for clean also meant cut. Did you know that? That to be pure was to be stripped. That to be holy was to be exposed. They believed that skin was a sin unless it had been bled. That teeth were evil unless they had tasted ash. That a body untouched by suffering was a body unworthy of salvation. And so they devised more ways to suffer. Mouth rinses of copper and vinegar. Tongue scrapes with obsidian shards. Nasal purges with salt and wormwood. Ear cleansings with live ants. Yes, live ants. Inserted gently into the canal. Left to crawl, to bite, to eat whatever wax they could find. Then shaken loose and crushed under the heel of a sanctified sandal. And all of it written down as wisdom. But wisdom is a strange thing in Egypt. It often smells like rot. Even the dead couldn't escape. By now, you know this. But have you thought of the children buried with their mouths sealed shut? Not just with wax, but with words, with instructions. May this child enter the afterlife cleansed, as if a 5-year-old needed to confess, as if a girl who died coughing up her lungs needed to repent for unwashed teeth. The burial priests would open the mouths of the dead, brush their teeth with ash one last time, then seal them shut again. Sometimes the teeth fell out. No matter. A resin plug would suffice. The gods wouldn't notice, or maybe they would. Maybe that's why no one has heard from them since. Now pause, just for a moment, and ask yourself this. Why does this all feel familiar? Why does the idea of brushing through pain feel close? Why does the image of bleeding into a basin feel like memory? Because you've done it. Maybe not with hoof and ash, but with toothpaste that burned, with mouthwash that stung, with routines done not because they helped, but because you were told they mattered. You, too, have spit pink into the sink and told yourself you are clean. You, too, have smiled through infection. And so this story isn't just Egypt's. It's yours. It's ours. The rituals change. The pain remains. And the gods are still silent. There's a point in every civilization where the body becomes a symbol. And in Egypt, that point came quietly, like mold blooming beneath paint. You wouldn't have seen it in the murals. They told prettier stories. You wouldn't have heard it in the hymns. They were trained to whisper only praise. But it was there in the silence behind temple doors, in the pause between ritual chants, in the cracked teeth behind jeweled smiles. They had turned the body into something to apologize for, and from that shame came ritual. From that ritual came rot. And yet the rot was dressed in gold. You see, the higher you climbed in Egyptian society, the more elaborate the self-inflicted cleansing became. It was no longer enough to brush your teeth with ash and bone. Now the brush itself had to be carved from sacred wood, harvested only during certain moon phases, anointed in perfumed oil, and dried in shadow for 40 nights. The ash? It had to come from papyri burned in ritual, mixed with resin scraped from temple doors. The water? Not water wine or goat's milk or the tears of the morning, depending on what day the calendar claimed was lucky. It was hygiene by hierarchy, purification by politics. And the more complicated the ritual became, the more they believed it worked, because the more it hurt, the more it must be working. And so pain became a performance. Let me take you inside one of these performances. A high priestess preparing for a solstice ceremony. She begins at dawn, not with food, not with prayer, but with bleeding. She uses a sharpened reed to scrape the inner lining of her mouth, just enough to break skin. Then she takes powdered hoof and applies it directly to the wound. It stings. She shakes. She weeps. The weeping is good. It shows the gods she is sincere. She rinses with a mixture of lemon and urine. The acid burns deeper. Her breath smells like old iron. She drinks nothing, eats nothing. Her body, they say, must be empty to be filled with holiness. Her teeth, once white and straight, now bend inward, black at the base. She's 27. She's considered pure. Her servant stands nearby, holding the bowl where she will later spit blood. The bowl is carved from alabaster, once beautiful, now permanently stained. No one asks how many mouths it has served. No one dares. Because to question the bowl is to question the ritual, and the ritual is sacred, even when it smells like infection, even when it sounds like someone trying not to scream. Later, this same priestess will stand before hundreds and sing. Her mouth will split on the high notes. Her breath will carry the scent of everything she tried to hide. And still they will call her divine, because she followed the steps, because she hurt enough, because no one dared ask how she felt, only how she looked. But the mouth was not the only altar. The skin, too, had its rituals. And the most sacred, the most disturbing, the most quietly cruel of them all was the exfoliation. Not with stones or sponges, but with salt. Crushed, blessed, mixed with oil, and scrub it into the flesh until it blistered. This was done not by choice, but by instruction. Once a week. More, if you had sinned. And sin was flexible. It could mean anything from lust to laughter to laziness to eating too soon after sunset. So they scrub it and bled. And when the blood dried, they covered it in powdered natron and called it holy. Children did this. Elders did this. Slaves did this. The Pharaoh did this. And no one said a word. One woman older now, back hunched from a lifetime of bending before altars, has no skin left on her arms that hasn't been broken at least once. She says it keeps her young. Her granddaughter watches and copies. She's 5. She already has scabs on her shoulders. She tells herself they're beautiful. And isn't that the saddest part? That they believed the wounds were lovely. But perhaps the most sinister ritual of all was one done not to the body, but to what came out of it. Let's talk about spit. In most cultures, spit is dismissed. Rude, dirty, forgotten. Not here. In Egypt, spit was power. Spit was prayer. Every morning, the devout would collect the first saliva that gathered in their mouths. They would not swallow it. They would not waste it. They would spit into bowls, into cloth, into sand. Then they would mix it with ash, with oil, with crushed copper. And they would use it to anoint wounds, to cleanse feet, to mark foreheads. It was believed that the first spit of the day held the essence of last night's dreams, that it could heal, that it could curse, that it could purify, but only if it was clean. And so, if your first spit of the day came with blood or pus or pieces of tooth, you were warned. The gods were displeased. You had sinned, you had failed. So what did they do? They began to force the mouth to lie. They'd swish herbs all night, sleep sitting up, rub their gums with honey to coat them. Some would even sew a small pouch of mint leaves into their cheek overnight to disguise the smell of decay. And if that failed, if they woke to find blood in their bowl, they would not show it. They would bury the bowl. They would start over. They would pretend. Because cleanliness was never about truth. It was about the illusion of truth. And in the desert, illusions lasted longer than bodies. Now let me take you to the Nile, not the myth. The river, real, dirty, divine, deadly. It was sacred, yes. And it was diseased, and they drank from it anyway. They brushed beside it, bathed in it, bled into it, and still they worshipped it. They built temples to it, threw coins into it, named gods after it, even as it choked on their waist, even as it fed them parasites that coiled around their intestines like silent serpents. One man, a fisherman, brushes his teeth with river mud and mint leaves. It's all he can afford. He swears it keeps the demons out. His teeth are gone. His gums are gray. His breath smells like fish left too long in the sun. But he smiles. He says, "The gods are kind to me." He dies 3 days later. Worms in the liver. The priest who blesses his body spits into his own hand before the final prayer. And the cycle begins again, because no one stops, because no one dares stop, because to stop would mean questioning everything. And in Egypt, questions are more dangerous than disease. And so the rituals continue. Ash in the mouth, salt in the skin, spit on the forehead, pain in the name of love, death in the name of cleanliness. And through it all, silence. A silence so loud it rings through time. So loud it deafens truth. So loud you almost believe it. Almost, but not quite. Because now you know. Now you've smelled it. Now you've tasted it. And it doesn't taste like gold. It tastes like what it always was. Blood, salt, ash, lies. And yet somehow, still beautiful. Still human. Still desperate to be seen as pure, even when no one is watching. By now, you've stopped flinching. That's how it happens. At first, the blood is shocking, the pain grotesque, the ritual is absurd. But then your senses dull, your breath slows. The disgust turns into understanding, and the understanding into something worse, recognition. Because when you strip away the geography, the language, the names of the gods, what's left is a very human disease, the belief that suffering earns redemption. And nowhere did that belief crystallize more than in the wombs of Egyptian mothers who passed it on not with words, but with ash-stained kisses and bleeding smiles. Because these rituals weren't just practiced. They were inherited. They were taught before speech, before thought, absorbed like dust through the skin. A mother brushing her daughter's gums with ash before she could even crawl. A grandmother rinsing a toddler's tongue with vinegar to harden her spirit. A father handing down the same bone-handled toothpick he used as a boy, now worn smooth from generations of mouths that believed rot could be scrubbed into righteousness. It didn't feel like torture. It felt like love. But love here was always lined with pain. Let's go now to a home, not rich, not poor, just middle, the kind that history forgets. A family of 4. The mother, exhausted, holds her daughter still while her husband prepares the mouthpaste. It's thicker today. He added more natron. The child squirms, but not because she's scared, because she knows what's coming. This is not her first time. Her mouth already bleeds when she smiles. But she lets them do it, because she was told the gods love the clean, and she wants to be loved. The brush enters. She gags. He continues. The mother sings softly. The girl screams once, and then stills. When it's done, the father kisses her forehead. The mother calls her brave. And they smile as they rinse the blood away. They don't know any different. They don't know any better. And that is the tragedy. Not that they suffered, but that they believed it was sacred. That's how this rot took root, not in the body, but in the soul. It wasn't just about cleaning anymore. It was about being worthy. And worthiness in Egypt was always paid for in flesh. Even the scribes wrote about it quietly, between the lines of hymns. One fragment, lost to time except for a partial translation scratched into a servant's bracelet, reads, "To cleanse the child is to give her back to the gods." Back, as if the body were on loan, as if breath were a debt, as if the gods could only be repaid in enamel and blood. And so the children bled, softly, regularly, proudly. And when they didn't, when the gums stayed pink, the breath too warm, the teeth too white, the parents would worry. Because health looked suspicious. Because decay felt familiar. Because pain was proof you were trying. Let's move now to the House of Learning, one of the great schools of priesthood. Here, boys not yet 12 are taught not only how to read, but how to suffer. Before each lesson, they brush. Not their minds, their mouths. A scribe inspects the bowls. The bloodier the rinse, the higher the praise. One boy clever, quiet learns to cut his gums first with a tiny blade, just enough to make the paste burn deeper. He is called devout. He is given extra scripture. He is being groomed to be high priest. His teeth fall out by 17. He dies from an infection in the jaw. They say the gods took him early, because he was too pure for this world. They never speak of the bowl they found under his cot. Still wet, still red, but that's how it was. Pain was never questioned, only ranked. And the deeper the pain, the higher the soul. The slaves saw it too, from the outside, watched their masters brush until they bled, and believed the gods were mad. But then, slowly, they copied, not from reverence, from desperation. Because the clean were safer. Because the clean were noticed. Because even the lowest might be spared if their mouth smelled less like hunger and more like holiness. And so, ash spread, like a parasite that whispered, "You are dirty, but I can make you clean." Even if it meant chewing charcoal until your teeth cracked. Even if it meant burning your tongue with metal coins kissed during rituals. Even if it meant scraping the roof of your mouth with broken pottery until you couldn't eat for days, they still did it. Because to be unclean was to be invisible. And to be invisible was worse than death. But death, too, had its rights. We've touched on them, but let's look closer than is comfortable. The ritual of the final mouth. Before burial, the corpse's mouth had to be purified. Not once, not twice, 7 times, each with a different substance. Hoof ash, myrrh paste, crushed pearl, vinegar, honey, blood, spit. From a priest considered clean, he would lean in, whisper a prayer, then spit into the dead's mouth. No one questioned the hygiene. No one wondered how many times he had bled that week. Because his pain had made him holy. Because his rot was sanctioned. And the corpse, no matter how decayed, was now called pure, sealed with a kiss of sickness. And so the mouth was closed, and the silence became sacred. And no one ever asked what grew behind it. And now, as we hover in this half-darkness, this space between worship and horror, ask yourself something you've been avoiding. If cleanliness in Egypt was a ritual of pain... If worth was measured in blood and ash... If children were taught to suffer before they could read, then what exactly were they afraid of? Because it wasn't just the gods. It wasn't just disease. It wasn't even death. It was being unworthy. It was being seen, truly seen, for what they were beneath the linen. flesh, and fear, just like us. And that's the final truth that tastes worst of all, that we too inherit rot, not in our bones, in our beliefs, and we call it tradition, and we call it love, and we pass it on, one bleeding smile at a time. And now we stand at the last door, not the gilded archway of a temple, not the cold slab of a tomb, not the curtain of perfumed silk that separates royalty from rot, but the door behind the eyes, the one that opens only when all illusions have burned, when all incense has faded into throat-tightening smoke, when even the priests forget the hymns and the mouth, finally, falls silent. This is not a door you walk through. This is a door that opens when there's nothing left to say. And in Egypt, that door opens slowly, deliberately, painfully, like a jaw unhinged after centuries of pretending it never needed to scream. Because by the end, they weren't brushing to stay clean anymore. They were brushing to stay sane, and failing, one stroke at a time. The final stage of this obsession wasn't marked by deeper ritual. It was marked by collapse, not the crumbling of cities, not the shattering of statues, but the quiet implosion of belief. A boy sits in the shadow of a dying dynasty, surrounded by sand, by silence, by myths that no longer echo, and he brushes his teeth with a powder made from the bones of a dead ibis. Not because he believes it will help, but because he's terrified to stop. He doesn't pray. He doesn't chant. He just scrapes. Bleeds, stares, scrapes again. He's too young to understand that the gods are gone, but old enough to feel that no one's listening anymore. And so he brushes, until the blood dries black in the corners of his mouth, until the taste of bone becomes more familiar than food, until even the pain no longer proves he exists. Elsewhere, an old embalmer prepares a body he knows won't be buried. There are no more tombs, no more linen, no more ceremonies. But he goes through the motions anyway, packs the nose with ash, scrubs the teeth with salt and oil, breaks off the lower jaw to better reach the throat. He has no audience, no apprentice, just habit, just ritual clinging to him like the stench that will not lift, even in dreams. He speaks to the corpse, not in prayer, in apology. I don't know if this means anything anymore, he says, but it's all I know. Then he washes his own mouth out with vinegar, though there's no one left to check his breath. He dies a week later. No one finds him. The body is eaten by dogs. The teeth, still stained with hoof and charcoal, remain untouched, because even the dogs know better. And still, somewhere, someone is brushing. A mother, a child, a priest without a god. By now, the powders are gone. The tools are broken. They use sticks, shards, fingers. They brush not to become clean, but to feel control. Because when everything else is lost, ritual is the last rope you wrap around your throat and call salvation. They scrape the same spots, even when the teeth are gone. They mix their own blood with dirt and call it paste. They whisper names of gods they've invented just to feel heard. And when they wake in the middle of the night, choking on the taste of ash, they don't cry. They brush, because crying is noise. And noise might mean they're still human. And being human in this place, in this history, is too dangerous to risk. So silence becomes the final prayer. Not the silence of reverence, the silence of rot. The silence of gumless smiles and rituals done in shadows. The silence of mothers teaching daughters how to hide the smell of their mouths from men who no longer care. The silence of priests burying their own teeth in jars, convinced they're offerings. The silence of a civilization that spent thousands of years trying to cleanse itself and forgot how to speak. There is no word for this ending. Only taste, only texture. A blend of ash, bile, fear, and memory. And even that will fade, because time, like breath, runs out. And no one rushes the dust off the forgotten. So they disappear, one tooth at a time, one lie at a time, one generation at a time, until all that's left is us. And the question we never want to ask out loud, when we brush, what are we trying to erase? And so, here we are, not at the end, but at the point where ends no longer matter, where the dust settles not because it was meant to, but because there is no breath left to stir it. You've walked with me through the mouths of the dead, felt the sting of vinegar against open wounds, gagged on the lies laced with resin and myrrh, listened to children bleed just to be called clean. You've stopped flinching. That's good. That means you're finally able to see not just the rituals, but the shadow underneath them, the thing that looks like faith, smells like rot, and speaks only in the voice of those too terrified to be human without apology. The Egyptians didn't fear dirt. They feared being seen without armor. And ash, as you've learned, was their most reliable disguise. But let me whisper something that even they never dared to say aloud. No one was ever clean. Not once. Not for a single breath. Not the priests who burned their mouths with salt until they could no longer eat. Not the queens who painted over pus with crushed lapis. Not the mothers who forced hoof dust into their daughters' mouths until blood ran like honey from their gums. Not the slaves who rinsed with Nile water until their intestines turned against them. Not the embalmer who washed corpses with sacred ash while his own teeth rotted in his jaw. They were never clean. They only looked clean. And when a civilization teaches its people to worship the look of something over its truth, decay is no longer a tragedy. It becomes design. So the question is not, how did it happen? You know that now. It happened because they were taught to brush harder instead of asking why they needed to. Because they believed that silence was sacred, that bleeding was blessed, that pain was the only proof of devotion. They did not cleanse to heal. They cleansed to disappear, to carve themselves into something the gods could tolerate. And the gods, if they ever existed, watched as an entire civilization ripped its own flesh open in worship and said nothing. And maybe that's the most faithful thing gods ever do. But the real horror doesn't live in temples or tombs. It lives in the mirror, because you brush too. Every day. You open your mouth. You reach for something minty, something white, something that foams and stings and burns just enough to convince you it's working. And you tell yourself it's clean. You don't see the child inside. You're still terrified of being called dirty. You don't hear your own heartbeat echoing the same rhythm the priests once did. Scrape, spit, smile. Scrape, spit, smile. You don't see how you've turned it into ritual. How you trust the sting. How you need it. How when it doesn't sting, you wonder if it even counts. You were taught, just like them, that discomfort is evidence. That pain is permission. That if something burns, it must be purifying. You were taught to believe in blood without ever calling it that. And maybe you've never used hoof dust, or goat bile, or salt that split your tongue. But tell me, when you swished mouthwash that made your eyes water, did you stop? Or did you lean into it, like they did, and tell yourself, yes, this is what clean feels like. This is how rot survives. Not in the corpse. In the choreography. Because the choreography outlives the body. It passes from parent to child, toothbrush to toothbrush, basin to basin, mirror to mirror. Not as a curse, but as love. Because the ones who taught you didn't know either. They brushed their fear into your gums, the same way it had been brushed into theirs. They told you to smile. Not wide enough to show the cracks. Just wide enough to be forgiven. But rot, like memory, doesn't vanish when ignored. It waits. Quietly. It coats the rituals in sugar and silt and synthetic peppermint, and it whispers, keep going. You're almost worthy. And so you keep going. We all do. Because it's easier to repeat than to reimagine. Easier to sting than to stop. Easier to believe than to bleed for nothing. But what if you stopped? What if one morning you opened your mouth and didn't flinch at what came out? What if you allowed your breath to smell like breath? Not lotus, not lemon, not denial. What if your gums, cracked and worn from decades of performance, were allowed to rest? Would the gods come for you? Would your mother? Would your mirror? Or would there be only silence? And is that silence peace or proof that without pain you're invisible? Because that is what Egypt taught us. That silence can be sacred, but only if it hurts first. That absence of stink is more important than the presence of truth. That the dead should be brushed one final time so they look clean, even as they liquefy inside their wrappings. That the living should lacerate their mouths before prayer. That love is best expressed through control. And that to be untouched by ritual is to be unworthy of being remembered. And yet we remember them, not for their pyramids, not for their gods, but for their breath, for their rot, for the quiet war they fought every day inside their own bodies, and for the fact that they lost, because we all do. Eventually, the gums recede, the enamel thins, the rituals break down, the toothbrush snaps, the powders run out, the blood stops coming, not because you're clean, but because there's nothing left to bleed. And then you smile, and you wait, and you realize no one is watching. No one is measuring your worth by the flavor of your breath. No one is keeping score. No gods, no parents, no priests, only you. And that's the moment. That's the door. That's the final rite. Not brushing, not bleeding, but breathing in, out, without apology, without perfume, without fear. Just breath. Dry, cracked, human breath. Can you do it? Can you stand in the legacy of hoof and ash and vinegar and say, I will not continue this? Can you let the silence be just silence? Can you stop pretending that pain is purity? That foam is forgiveness? That scent is salvation? Because if you can, then you are the first. The first in thousands of years to see past the ritual, to see the person beneath the ash, to see the child behind the bleeding, to see yourself, not clean, not dirty, just here, still breathing, still beautiful, and no longer brushing away the truth.